Hello and welcome to another of Keystone Tutors webinars. My name is Jenny McGowan. I'm Keystone's Asia Director based in Hong Kong. And today's webinar is about computerized testing at 11 plus and 13 plus. And so the aim of today is to give parents an overview really of what types of tests are used, why they're used, how they're scored, so that you have a better understanding of what these tests look like and why schools use them. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about, the preparation and what we would recommend in terms of preparing your children for these tests. So I've got a kind of presentation prepared with lots of sample questions and information, which I'm going to talk through. If there are any questions at all, please do pop them in the Q&A function within Zoom, and I will review any questions that appear in there. And equally, though, there should be some time for some questions at the end if you have them. So I'll get going. And so the first thing I was just going to, I suppose, give an overview of is what the entry points are to kind of UK schools and when these tests are used. Because not all schools use computerized testing, and they may use computerized testing at one entry point, not another. So I just wanted to give a quick overview, and it might be that people already know quite a lot about this, but just to give you a sense of what the options look like. And I'm talking here about senior schools predominantly. There are some prep schools that also use computerized testing, but that's kind of less common. So I'm focusing on senior schools here. So the 11 plus process into year 7 is the first, I guess, major time that students are assessed, and computerized tests can form quite an important part of that process. For 11 plus entry, most of the testing takes place 1 year before. So it tends to be at the start of year 6 for entry into year 7. And the testing would take place in the kind of October, let's say, of year 6. If we then think about 13 plus, which especially for international families is probably the most common, and it's also the most varied in terms of the admissions process. So there are quite a lot of schools that actually do their testing 3 years before. So actually you're taking the tests at the same time the 11 plus candidates are also doing that. And often this is when the computerized test takes place. So that would be the autumn of year 6 for entry into year 9. There are some schools that then do that 2 years before, so this kind of autumn of year 7, and then there are some schools that actually do it in the autumn of year 8. So for 13 plus, exactly when the testing takes place can actually vary quite significantly, and it might be that the testing is actually staggered over a couple of years. Some schools will do a computerized test first, and then they might have a second stage of assessments kind of later on. So 13 plus is for sure, I guess, the most varied in terms of what those admissions process looks like. 14 plus then goes back to 1 year before. So again, any testing would be the autumn of year 9 before you start in year 10. And then 16 plus is also the same. So it's 1 year before. So the majority of testing for UK independent schools is 1 year before. 13 plus is the exception, really, where you can have quite a lot of different options in terms of exactly when those tests can take place. And this is where having clarity and being organised and prepared is really helpful, so that you've got an overview of exactly when those might take place. Okay, so just thinking briefly again about how schools actually assess applicants. So where do computerized tests, fall within this process? Because a lot of people get quite fixated on computerized testing, partly because it's often the first stage. And so that's where the focus is. But actually, there's a lot more to it than that. And the way that schools use computerized tests can be quite different. So you need to bear them in mind in the context of the rest of the process. And so, just to give some examples here of what most schools do, but again, this obviously varies school by school, is that there's always a process of looking at school reports and a reference. So the UK schools want to know how you're currently doing at school, and if there are any concerns or issues currently, and they just want a sense from your current teachers of what the students are like in class and attendance and things like that. So the school reports and references are a little bit softer if you think about it that way, whereas then the rest of this process is much more around the kind of academic potential of the students, of which computerized tests often form a big part, and we are going to talk about that for the rest of this session. But it's also worth bearing in mind that a lot of schools will often use written papers. That might be a second stage of the process. It might be alongside a computerized test. And again, same for interviews or group tasks or group assessments. And all of these things combine to give the school as much information as possible. So computerized tests are for sure important, but they're not the only thing that schools are looking at. And it's just worth bearing in mind when you're preparing, I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, that actually the preparation needs to focus on the whole process rather than just the computerized test. So why are schools using computerized testing? This is definitely on the increase. In the past decade, this has become much more popular with schools. It used to be very paper-based. Most things were written down, and there's been an increase in the computerized tests being used. I think one very practical, obvious reason is that the interest in UK boarding schools has been increasing, especially at the top, more competitive schools. And actually, a computerized test is an easier way to test lots of people all at once. There's very little effort on the school's part involved in marking and then administering the test, because a lot of it is done remotely. And so it just allows them to screen kind of greater numbers of candidates. I think, in some ways it's as simple as that. But it's also a measure of potential. And I think this is where computerized testing for kind of international students or students based outside of the UK is that actually computerized testing can be quite helpful, because instead of them just drilling on certain areas of knowledge from the UK curriculum, which is often what written papers are, a lot of computerized testings are measures of potential. So it's the kind of problem solving and critical thinking elements within the reasoning parts of these tests, which tell schools a lot about how that child thinks and what their potential is, not just, have they learned fractions in maths yet, because actually due to curriculum differences, they might not have done that. There are some tests that do have curriculum content in them, but the main thing is about the reasoning and the measure of potential being less curriculum focused. The other thing is that it gives a standardized score. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second in terms of what that means. And essentially it just allows schools to compare students easily. So obviously within an academic year, there's a range of ages and birthdays of students, and a standardized age score allows for that. And so the scores can be compared across students, and that makes it easier for schools to kind of get a sense of how that student is doing compared to their date of birth. And then they're also adaptive. And if I just talk about what that means a little bit. So adaptive testing essentially means that the questions throughout the test kind of alter depending on how the student is doing. So this diagram here makes it look a little bit more sophisticated than it is. Often it's not quite this complex. There's kind of just different levels within the questions that the student moves through if they are getting questions correctly. This is quite a sophisticated diagram of an adaptive test. But the idea is that if you are doing very well, the test will challenge you. So it means that the test can get harder, and the school then really knows what the ability of that child is. Whereas a written paper obviously has a ceiling. There's only so many questions in it, and a student could get 100%, and actually you don't know what the upper bounds of that level might look like. Whereas an adaptive test means that the student firstly is answering questions that they should be able to answer, but it also means that the school can see really how good you are, because the test kind of adapts to how the student is doing. As I say, then probably not quite as sophisticated as the test makers might lead you to believe, but there is an element of adaptiveness within the tests, within most of them, not all of them. And then just quickly on standardized age scoring. So I'm going to talk about how the different tests score and how they work as I talk about some of the tests. But I just thought it might be useful to kind of give a sense of how these scores, work in the grand scheme of things. And so, as I say, an SAS score is a standardized age score. And it just means that it's taken into account how old the child is, the level of questions that they should be able to answer for their age, and if they're doing kind of better or worse than what would be expected. And most of these tests work on a score that's not dissimilar to an IQ test that adults might be familiar with. So it kind of goes up to normally around about 140, with 100 being the average. So the assumption is that 100 means that you are working at the age that you are, whereas obviously the higher you go, the more exceptional that becomes. And schools will look at where you're falling within the cohort that they're testing, and it allows them to compare students, again, not taking into account age and things like that. And so it's a snapshot really of how that child is doing. And obviously how schools use that score is quite different. So some will, have an SAS in mind that if you don't get that, they simply won't let you through to the next stage because they deem that level to be what is necessary to cope at the school. Other schools will, take the top however many percentage to then interview. So it's less about the individual score, it's more about how you've done compared to everybody else. And others will still interview, everybody or get everybody to do the written papers, but they're bearing in mind the SAS from the computerized test. It's less of a harsh screening mechanism, and all schools will use this slightly differently. So often I'm asked, well, what score do I need? And yeah, there are scores for sure that we, know certain schools will probably be aiming for, and that information is sometimes shared by schools if you ask them. But actually, it's more around doing the best you can within the cohort that you're competing against, because ultimately that's how those decisions are normally being made. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the specific tests that exist. However, the kind of caveat here is that actually most of these tests are doing similar things. So yes, there are different providers, different publishers that have made different tests and different versions of things. That is all true. The reality is they are all relatively similar. And it's quite likely actually that your child might have to take more than one of these tests. And so what we're trying to think about when we're looking at the questions and the preparation is actually to be flexible. So you want a child to be able to deal with whatever question is put in front of them, rather than fixating on, well, is that in the ICB pretest or not? Partly because you don't always know the answer to that, but also because it might be that they have to take multiple different types of tests anyway. But obviously there are differences, and I'm going to talk about some of those. But it's just worth bearing in mind that actually most of what I'm saying is similar across all of these tests in terms of what they're doing. So just to give you, I guess, some examples, and I'm going to talk about the ICB pretest, I'm going to talk about the UK ISET and the CAT4 in a little bit more detail, because they're the ones that our families and clients tend to come across the most. The ICB pretest is probably the most common one that students are asked to take. A lot of the kind of top independent schools in boarding, but also the London day schools use the ICB pretest. It's designed for all students, so there is no difference based on where you're at school or where you're from or whether English is an additional language or not. Everybody takes it. So if you're applying to these schools, it's the same test across the board, and it's predominantly aged kind of 10 to 12. So most people are taking this in year 6. That's the most common age, but you can do it into year 7. And I have known schools even use it in year 8, even though that is much less common. So year 6 is the key time for the ICB pretest. The UK ISET is designed for international students specifically. This test seems to be going out of favour a little bit. There are fewer schools using it. It used to be a very popular screening test if you were based outside of the UK. It was something that lots of schools would ask parents to show before you even applied. There are still schools that do that, but it does seem to be less popular than it used to be, and it's specifically designed for students who are not based in the UK, and therefore there's a much heavier English component on it, where they're trying to assess level of English and make sure that that's good enough for the school. And then there are then a load of other tests published by companies like GL and Chem. The CAT4, for example, is a popular one that GL produced that people have probably heard of. There's also like Chem Select, which is an English and maths test. And then, of course, there are school-owned tests as well. So some independent schools have kind of commissioned their own computerized tests. So, for example, Harrow and Eton both have that as part of their second stage of their testing, where they've had those produced for them. But again, the reality is they are pretty similar to what the other tests do. They're just a little bit more challenging because the student is a bit older and the school wants to kind of stretch them a little bit more. But the reality is the school-owned ones are pretty much all based off, existing software or question banks that exist and that have been standardized by much bigger companies like GL originally. So there's a lot of different types of these tests out there. But as I say, actually a lot of them are relatively similar. But I am going to go through now, as I say, the kind of popular ones, just to give you some information about them, some sample questions, so that you've got an idea of what's in them. But all of these tests now have online, kind of walkthroughs where they're showing you the types of questions. It's all a lot more transparent than it used to be. And some of the questions that I've chosen to show you are actually from older versions of the tests, because actually the content is still relevant and they're not in the current walkthrough. So it just gives you a little bit examples that you can't easily find. So if we start with the ISCB pretest, as I say, this is probably the most common or popular one. It's entirely computerized and entirely multiple choice, and it has 4 sections. So English, maths, non-verbal reasoning, and verbal reasoning. And again, I would say these sections are relatively common. I guess the slight nuance here, based on what I was saying earlier about potential, is that the English and maths sections of the ICB pretest are in some ways based on the UK curriculum. So the maths content assumes that you have studied what you should have studied for your age group by the time you take the test. And again, the English, the kind of level of vocabulary and comprehension and grammar that's expected, again, is based on the British curriculum, because this test is not differentiated depending on whether you're international or not. So this test does have an element of needing to make sure that you're up to date with what you would have been studying if you were in a UK school. And that is also relevant even if you're in a British international school, because again, British international schools, whilst they are following the British curriculum, that they're not on a bound in the same way that UK schools are with which topics are taught when. So it's quite likely that there are just differences in order or level or how far along you might be. So it's worth always double checking what is in the British curriculum. And I'm going to share some links later, which will give you that syllabus to look at, rather than assuming that your school is covering what is needed, because that is not always the case. So if I could give some examples then. So within the English part of the ICB pretest, there are kind of 2 sections. So there's a comprehension section, which is kind of what the top left is showing here, where essentially the child is given a piece of text to read, and then there are a series of multiple choice questions about the text. So again, that's kind of, comprehension, understanding, processing of information. Need the ability to read and digest pretty quickly what you're reading. And it's more along the lines of, again, potentially what students are doing at school, that kind of analysing and reading texts and then working out what is being said. And then the other types of questions are either then about kind of spelling or grammar. So again, testing punctuation and grammar within different styles of questions. So it might be kind of like correcting sentences like that question on the kind of top right shows. It could also be about speech and things like that. And then the other types of questions are more around kind of vocabulary and word choice. So, you know, picking the right word to finish a sentence. So the English is kind of made up of a combination of comprehension, but then also slightly more technical questions about that student's English ability. And again, the things that are being asked here are topics that the student should have ordinarily covered at school if they were covering the British curriculum. So then the maths questions, yeah, I guess is a bit more straightforward in the sense that ultimately they are mathematical numerical questions, again, around what the students should have covered at this stage in the curriculum. I guess the big difference, I would say, compared to what lots of students may have been exposed to already, is that the questions are quite wordy at times. So I've purposely picked here the kind of wordier questions, where actually sometimes the numbers and the maths is actually not that difficult, but they've put it into a, you know, a real life context or something that is not just doing the kind of numbers and the calculation. And again, I think this is less common, having been based, say, in Hong Kong for quite a while. My experience is that in local schools or even in international schools, there's a lot more kind of number crunching rather than necessarily real life context. So that's just something to bear in mind for the maths. Even if your maths is very good, actually these questions are sometimes a different style to what you may be doing or may be facing at school. But ultimately, the maths questions, I think, in some ways are probably the most familiar to students in terms of the content, because they are things that you probably have already covered. Whereas then if we talk about reasoning, these are then the questions that are often quite new and abstract to students. These are not things that are normally taught in school. Even if you're in a UK school, you know, unless you're doing specific prep for these tests, these are not the types of things that are normally tested. And the reason why schools like reasoning is because it's actually harder to improve. You know, you kind of have these skills and the ability to think and problem solve. You know, you can't necessarily make huge improvements by drilling over and over and over again, and therefore schools see them as a true indicator of potential. But what reasoning essentially means is, yeah, it's kind of problem solving and working things out. And so we have verbal reasoning, which basically is with kind of words, but also can be numbers as well. Sometimes people think, well, hang on, that's not verbal, thinking that verbal only means words. But no, it can mean numbers, but it's like tangible things. So words that you might know or numbers that you might know, and then it's problem solving with those words and numbers. And again, there are some kind of examples there to give you a sense of what that might look like. And then non-verbal reasoning is basically problem solving, but with images. So this is kind of, again, not numbers and words. It's more around kind of codes and problem solving, using visuals and images and diagrams. And again, this is even, you know, non-verbal reasoning actually is something that people put quite a lot of emphasis on, because it really is based on your innate ability to work things out rather than any dependence on what you might have learnt before. Obviously, you can get better with practice. I'm not saying that you can't, you know, but if these questions kept getting more and more and more difficult, it becomes harder for students to just whiz through them. And therefore schools do quite like non-verbal, because it removes, again, the level of English. So if a student's English is not their first language, they might find some of the other questions difficult simply because of their English, when in fact it's not their ability. Whereas non-verbal is very clearly an indicator of problem solving. When you remove language, you remove knowledge. And therefore schools quite like this, especially for international students, because it can kind of tell you what the potential of that child might be, even if they haven't learned the things that they should have. So yeah, so those are kind of samples of the questions. As I say, these are actually old examples that I've kind of purposely used just to give you more examples than you might have seen in the walkthroughs. But the reality is they're all similar, and the format changes and they look slightly different, but actually what the questions are asking is always pretty similar. So how is the ICB pre-test scored? It's kind of the next thing I was going to talk about. So it's age standardized, so the same diagram there that I showed you before. Each section is scored out of 140. There's also then a total score as well. So you're given the schools are given the 4 individual sections, but then they're also given an overall score. So again, 100 would be average. Schools are also given information about the time that was taken for each section. So again, if someone has like whizzed through a section and then also scored very highly, that is a kind of a positive sign. But again, when I talk to schools, most of them say they're not that interested in the time. It's more around actually the overall score rather than rushing. The interesting thing about the ICB pretest is that scores are not released to you as parents. So once your child has taken the test, you do not know what they have scored. The scores are sent directly to the senior schools that you have applied for. Some senior schools may share it with you if you ask, especially maybe if you've been rejected. Sometimes they might say, look, it was because of your score and it was much lower than we'd have been expecting or whatever. But as default, you don't get the score. And that's partly, I think, because schools use them differently. And so the schools don't necessarily want to know that parents know what those scores look like. And as I mentioned before, some schools will have a very clear cutoff that they will use. Others use it much more holistically as part of the process, but it's not a screening tool. There are all sorts of different ways that it is used, and therefore I think schools don't necessarily want parents to know what that score looks like. In terms of the logistics of the ICB pretest, it can only be taken once per year. And if you are applying to multiple schools that require it, that one score is sent to all of the schools that you've applied to, which in many ways is the point of it. It's to try and reduce testing, reduce the amount of the burden, I suppose, on the students that are having to take these tests. So often it's designed to streamline, but it also makes it high stakes on the flip side of that, because you can only take it once and that same score is going to impact all of your schools that use that test. And it's worth noting that even if the deadlines within a year are different, the same score will still be shared. So to give an example, let's say you're applying to 2 senior schools that require the ICB pretest. Maybe one of them requires it in October, another school requires it by April. You have to take it by the October because that's the earliest that one of your schools is asking for, and that score is sent to the second school regardless. So even if you don't need to take it till April, you can't take it again later in the year. That same score from October is going to be used, whether you can't kind of wait and then prepare, in the sense that you have to meet the first deadline. You can then take it again a second year. So it might be that actually different schools require it a year later. It might be that actually the same school has said you can retake it. So it might be that the school says, actually, your score wasn't quite good enough this year. However, we like the other parts of your application. We'd like you to take this again. So you could be resitting it for the same school, or you could be taking it for different schools the following year. But if it's within the same year, the same score is used for all of the schools that you are applying to. And often, as international families, this is also taken remotely wherever you live. So if you're in Hong Kong or Singapore or Japan, you can often take these computerized tests. And the ICB pretest is a very common one that people take it kind of in their home country. They may then need to travel to the UK later, but all of this is done kind of where you live at your local testing centre or British Council or something like that. Yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, the ICB pretest in a nutshell. And as I say, there's lots of information out there. There's walkthroughs on the ICB website, so you can find more sample questions. They have guides of what's in it if you want more questions. And actually, I'm going to share some resources later where you can kind of go to practice and find out a lot more about that test. So moving on to the CAT 4, which is, again, I would say this is actually increasing in popularity. Not many schools used to use this, but a lot more schools I find are using the CAT 4 than they used to. So similarly to the ICB pretest, it's entirely computerized and multiple choice. It's slightly different in terms of how it's leveled and the adaptiveness works. So the Cat 4 actually has a range of levels. So kind of level A is for kind of 7-year-olds, and then it kind of goes up each year through creating a slightly more difficult test depending on the age of the child, rather than necessarily the test being adapted within each level. So if you're taking level C, those questions are fixed for you at the start based on your age. They don't adapt, but because the test has different levels, that's the kind of adaptive nature of it. And the senior school that has asked you to take it will determine the level. So they might give you a level that is at your age. It might be that actually they give you a harder level. So some of the more competitive schools may actually give a slightly more challenging one because they want to be able to test you beyond what you should know at your current age. But that level is determined by the school. You don't have a choice in that. They will send you the test that they want you to take. It has 4 subjects, and you'll kind of see ultimately these are relatively similar to the ICB pre-test. So you've got verbal reasoning, you've got quantitative reasoning, which is more around maths and use of numbers. There's then non-verbal, and then there's spatial, which again is the kind of shapes and things like that. This test takes just over an hour. So I think it's technically 72 minutes is the time that it takes. And it's broken down into sections within these 4 subjects as well. So I think each test is roughly about 8 or 9 minutes within it, but you kind of just work through them. It doesn't really matter exactly which test is what. Ultimately, it's about these 4 subjects, and then there are subtests within that. And again, the questions are very similar. So I've just put a bunch of questions on this one slide rather than going through each question. It just becomes very repetitive otherwise based on what I was saying for the ICB pre-test. And so again, you'll see that it's a similar type of thing. You've got the kind of the net questions and the imagery questions in the kind of bottom right hand side, which again is that problem solving, what comes next. Whereas the verbal and quantitative reasoning again is more mathematical and word and vocabulary kind of processing. So ultimately the questions in the Cat 4 are quite similar. I guess the big difference is that there's less about the curriculum in there. Quantitative reasoning is more around your manipulation of numbers rather than have you learned this specific topic, whereas the ICB pre-test is a little bit more topic based, but otherwise the questions are actually pretty similar in nature. And again, it's scored in quite a similar way as well. So it's age standardized score out of 140. Again, you can see I've put the table at the bottom that you get when you've like the Cat 4 results table, which again are not released to parents by default. Some schools might release them to parents. And actually for the Cat 4, this is a test that is also sometimes used internally within schools for levelling. So even if you're not applying for a UK school, your child may actually have taken the Cat 4 as part of their day-to-day schooling. There are schools that do a Cat 4 every September to give them a sense of how all of their students are doing. And in that case, sometimes results are released to parents because they're kind of given to you as a leveler of how your child is getting on. But again, it's not a default that the results are shared with parents. They're sent to the schools directly. This one can, in theory, the Cat 4 can, in theory, be taken multiple times because the way that the logistics work on this is that the senior school basically sends you the login for the test or sends the invigilation centre the login, obviously if you're taking it somewhere remotely. And so in theory, each school that you're applying to may send you a different login. So if you're applying for 3 schools that require the Cat 4, there is a chance that actually you do need to take it 3 times because each school is monitoring and administering that. Whereas the ICB pre-test is done at a central level and everything is sent out to schools, whereas the schools control the Cat 4 administration. So you can end up actually taking it multiple times for multiple different schools. But again, you can't practice it in the sense that you can't register yourself for it and do it that way. It has to be administered at the school level. And again, how schools use these scores, it is different. So it's similar to the ICB pretest. Some will have certain scores that they want to see, whereas others it might be a little bit more flexible in terms of how they use the Cat4 data. So then the final test I'm just going to run through in a little bit more detail is the UK ISET, and that is partly because, as I say, this is designed specifically for international students, and it therefore is slightly more common that families that we work with in Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., may be required to take it. The one thing I would say is that it's always worth checking about the UK ISET, especially if you are a native English speaker. So if you would consider your family native English speaking, or you are at let's say, a British or English curriculum school, it's always worth asking the senior schools if it is mandatory to take it, because ultimately the point of a UK ISET is to check for English level. That's kind of what its purpose is. And therefore, I've known schools to waive it for families where actually English is already the native language, because that kind of defeats the point of the test. So I would always ask the question with the UK ISET. I think schools are more willing to be a little bit more flexible on it than you might think. So this has 3 sections. There's a reasoning section, which is very similar to what we've just talked about already. So the reasoning is very much computerized, non-verbal, verbal, and math. So that's very similar to the Cat4 and the ICB pretest. However, it then deviates a little bit. So then there is a computerized English, like a Cambridge English test. So again, people might be more familiar with those if you're applying for like university and things where you have to have a certain level of English. So it is just the Cambridge English test embedded within it. And then there is a handwritten essay as well. And if I just give some examples of the 2 second parts, I'm not going to give more examples of reasoning questions. I think we've probably seen enough of those. But like, for example, there's a listening part to the Cambridge English test. So you basically play a piece of audio and then you're asked questions about it. So again, that's slightly different from any of the other types of tests, because it's about your listening, your ability to process that and then answer questions. And then the reading section as well is slightly more kind of, again, real life, I think is the way that they try to do it. So that it's about your day-to-day level of English rather than academic English. So again, you can see there are some questions here where it's about filling in words like an informal email or from a menu. So the questions are just a little bit less academic in nature, but there are then comprehension parts which are much more similar to what we've talked about within the ICB pretest as well. So there are bits that are similar, but it has a much greater emphasis on day-to-day use and understanding of English rather than, really super complicated comprehension. And then the other part, which is then not computerized at all, but is within this test, is that there is a 30-minute handwritten essay. So students are given one title. There's no choice about what question you do. The student is just given it, but it will be kind of age appropriate. And so I've just given some examples there around the essays that we've seen in the past, and you'll see that most of them are kind of non-fiction, so it tends to not be a story. It tends to be just, again, seeing how well a student can write and analyze and things like that. So in terms of the scoring for the UK ISET, the big difference here actually is that parents, you receive the results. So this is the one test where actually you are sent the results directly, normally pretty quickly after the test. They say that it's 72 hours, but you normally get it before that. And you receive an overview of the scores. Now, the senior schools do receive a more detailed report with a kind of greater breakdown of the data, but actually as parents, you get a snapshot of what those results look like. And the reasoning test scores on the right-hand side here, again, very similar to the standardized age scores that we've seen before. So that's just a sample, and it's telling you, they're calling it an ISS, but ultimately it is the same. It's a standardized age score across the different sections. And then you also get a Cambridge English score, again, if parents are familiar, it's a slightly different way of grading levels of English, where it goes from kind of A1 up to C1, depending on how good your English would be. And again, schools may have a cutoff where they might say, well, actually, we need a minimum of I don't know, a B2 to kind of take your application forward. So that's a slightly different scoring system because, as I say, it's an external test. The Cambridge English grading like that is a completely different thing that the UK ISET have just kind of bought in to use as part of their test. And this can also be taken every 4 months. So you've got a bit more flexibility with this. And again, what some parents therefore will do is, if you know you need to submit a UK ISET by a certain date, you could take it much earlier in the year to kind of see how things go. If the score is good enough, then great, you're kind of done. Whereas actually, if it wasn't quite as good as you had hoped, you could then in theory redo it 4 months later and then only send the most recent results to the senior school. So you've got a little bit more flexibility with the UK ISET in terms of the strategy around when to take it and how many times to take it. Whereas the ICB pretest and the CAT4 is completely dictated by the senior school, and you can't strategically plan when and if you retake it and things like that. So those are the kind of, I guess, I've picked those 3 tests to go through simply because they are the ones that are probably the most popular and that most of the families at Keystone are taking. However, it's worth saying here that there are obviously many variations of computerized testing available, but they are often testing similar things. And as I said right at the start, testing flexibility is actually really important. What you don't want is to focus on one very specific test, what the question should look like, what is going to be in it. Because actually there's nothing to say that the questions couldn't change. The ICB pretest, for example, has changed provider a couple of times since it existed. There's nothing to say that that won't happen again, and therefore the content may or may not change. So even if you're taking other tests, everything that I've said is still true, and everything I'm about to say about the preparation all still applies. Yes, there are obviously specifics around the format and the timing and things, and you do want your child to become familiar with the test they're going to take so that they know what to expect on the screen. But it's also just worth bearing in mind that you can use a range of resources for a range of different tests. And actually that can be quite helpful just to make the child a bit more flexible. And then if they do actually end up having to take a different test quite last minute or whatever, actually you've kind of built that flexibility into them, which is always much more helpful than not doing that, in my opinion. The other thing I just wanted to quickly say was that whilst we have been talking about computerized testing, the preparation information needs to bear in mind that you may also have to take written papers, which are probably going to be English and maths and dependent on the British national curriculum. You may have to take an additional subject. So some schools will add, for example, like science or humanities in there. And you need to bear that in mind. I've seen so many families focus exclusively on the computerized test because that's what comes first. And actually they've then forgotten about the other parts. And it is quite different, multiple choice testing where you've got to be quick and fast and accurate is quite different to obviously handwriting a comprehension piece. And so I just don't want you to forget about that. And the preparation that I'm going to talk about is relevant to that. So you're not just thinking about the computerized test, you're thinking about the preparation as a whole, and then looking at exam format, yes, but thinking that actually there's other parts of this process as well. And the other part is also kind of interviews. So again, a lot of the preparation around, reading and talking about your thoughts and analysing things are super helpful in interviews as well, because often they're going to ask you about favourite subjects. What are you reading? What are your thoughts about this? If you could change the world, what would you do? Those kind of things. And actually the broader preparation and discussion that comes with preparing for computerized testing also benefits the kind of written papers and the interviews. And I'm not going to talk any more about those because that's not really the point of today, but it's more just to not forget about them and not just focus on computerized testing. Okay, so preparation then. So what are kind of our recommendations in terms of how you would prepare for these tests? So one of the key things is thinking about, again, the skills and the content outside of fixating on a specific test. So looking at English and maths according to the relevant stage of the UK curriculum is going to be super important. So for the ICB pre-test, for example, that is important because the English and maths is based on that. But actually being able to manipulate numbers and things within the subjects that you should have studied is super helpful then in the quantitative reasoning within the Cat4, etc. So starting with what is covered in English and maths is basically crucial for all of these different tests. Now, the ICB have specifications for kind of 11 plus and 13 plus, so that you kind of know, if your child is in year 5, this is what they should have learned. If they're in year 6, this is what they should have covered already. And I think when you're in an international school or then in a local school, matching up what has been covered and what has not been covered is super important. It's very likely that there will be differences, especially obviously if you're in a different curriculum altogether. So if you're in an American school or you're in a local Singaporean school, obviously there are going to be differences, but even within the British schools, things are just taught in different orders. And the pace is often a little bit slower in an international school than it might be in a UK prep school. So this is super important for everybody. And in my follow-up email, I'll link the kind of ISEB specifications that I'm referring to so that you can go through and almost traffic light, green, definitely know this, through to kind of red where you're saying, have never studied that before. Okay, we need to learn that. So English and maths is going to be crucial for all of these tests, and then also for the written papers that I was referring to before. So that's the first thing that I would recommend everybody does. Gap match or gap identify what your child has done versus what the UK curriculum is expecting them to do, and then work to fill those gaps as much as possible is the kind of key thing really to start with. The rest of these kind of preparation tips are then, I guess, a little bit more general about English development. And this applies for students where English is their native language and also isn't, because actually your comprehension is going to be super important across all aspects of these tests, even just through reading the questions and knowing, what they're asking. Vocabulary, the greater range of vocabulary that you have, it's going to be much easier to answer those like punctuation, grammar type questions if you fully understand the sentence that you're reading. Whereas actually, if half the words are new to you, trying to identify grammar obviously becomes a lot more difficult. So reading and listening as much as possible in English is key across the board. And yes, of course, that can be reading in terms of books, and there are lots of reading lists out there. Again, I can share with you 11 plus, 13 plus reading lists to give you a sense of what children should be able to read at that age. But there's also news articles, blogs, there's lots of also like non-fiction out there that students can be reading, and actually exposing children to a wide range of writing styles is really, really helpful, because in the comprehension texts, whether this is in the computerized test or actually in the written text, you actually don't know what that is going to be. And it could be that it is a non-fiction like news article. There's nothing to say it wouldn't be that. Equally, it could be a Charles Dickens text that might be more obvious. So it's exposure to different types of text is really important. So books and stories and fiction, definitely, but also news, blogs, what's going on in the world. There's just a different style of writing in those that can be really helpful, and vocabulary as well. You're going to learn different words in non-fiction to fiction. There's also audio versions of these things. So again, I appreciate that lots of, children don't necessarily love sitting down with books and things. And whilst, yes, reading is more important than listening, because you can kind of see the words, you can look at the spelling. So there's greater benefits to that. Audiobooks and radio and things like that, again, it's giving discussion points. There'll be new words that you can then talk about. And so those are also great to do if, actually sitting down and reading is going to be quite challenging. So it's just exposure is the key. And as parents, you can massively help with that. So again, discussions at home about reading, academic subjects, what they're doing at school, again, it's kind of like, well, by you asking those questions, you're causing them to think about it a little bit more. Again, what 5 new words have you learned this week, for example. There are ways that you can have discussions about that. And I appreciate everyone is super busy, but it doesn't take long to just switch the focus of some of these discussions to more potentially academic subjects, and you're just reinforcing then the importance of these kind of new ideas and words and problem solving, and that can also obviously be within maths. You know, you could also do some mathematical problem solving, some reasoning, verbal at home, but I guess English and reading is a more, I guess, natural one to do in day-to-day conversation, but of course you can do that around the other subjects as well. And then the final point is, yeah, just watching, listening, kind of news and current affairs, and that's partly again through vocabulary and exposure, but it also just keeps children up to date with what's going on in the world. And if we think further ahead to things like interviews, it could be that topics come up around that, you know, certain views on things, or, you know, tell me something interesting that you've read in the news recently. So there are wider benefits to keeping up with current affairs. But when we think about computerized testing, actually from a vocabulary and interest perspective, it can be super helpful to do that. So then some resources, and again, I'll send all these links out to people in the follow-up email. You know, there are written ways that you can prepare for computerized tests, as well as working on computerized resources. And this might be because parents don't want a huge amount of screen time. You might be on I don't know, a flight or whatever. And so there are written books that you can buy around English, maths, verbal, non-verbal practice. So it doesn't all have to be done on a screen. There are options for things you can buy to have at home. And as I say, I'll send those links out so that you've got them. But then, of course, there is computerized preparation itself. And this obviously is super important because actually the kind of online multiple choice format actually for children is often quite unfamiliar. It's not something that they've done before, and so making time to actually practice on the computer with multiple choice under time conditions is super important, in addition to all of the other things that I've been saying. Often the timing is something that students really struggle with to start with, because in school you're very much encouraged to, you know, sit and think and work things out and go back and review. And actually you can't do that in these tests. Once you've moved on to the next question, the question is gone. So it's a different style of kind of approaching test questions, and therefore practicing under time conditions and speed on these platforms is really important, and kind of goes without saying that this should be kind of built in really to day-to-day life, especially in the run-up to these tests. And actually independent practice is important as well. Obviously, you know, we prepare students for these tests all the time, but what we don't want is for the student to become reliant on help or someone working through the questions. They really do need to be doing timed practice on their own, to get used to having to make decisions and having to answer questions without an adult that's going to kind of guide them through. And again, often for, you know, 10-year-olds, that's quite unfamiliar as a concept. So it is important that they do independent prep. I've then put some links there to platforms. These are kind of fairly well-known platforms that you may already be familiar with. Again, I would say they're all doing much of the same thing. And so I would just pick the one that, you know, suits you the best in terms of cost, or, you know, some of them have free trials that you can use. It might be that your current school is already using a platform, and actually sticking with that is easier. Again, I think they all have their kind of pros and cons. It's more a personal choice really as to which one you might want to use. And then, of course, there's tutoring. I mean, you know, that is kind of obviously at Keystone is the heart of what we do. And I think when you're in an international school, what a tutor can do is replicate what you would be doing if you were in a UK prep school. So in a lot of UK prep schools, this work is being embedded within the timetable, because their job is to prepare students for these senior school exams. Obviously, in an international setting, you're not really getting that. And so what we can do, or our tutors can do, is provide that structure, bridging the gap. They can do a lot of that work for you, that you're not going to be getting from your school in the same way that you would if you were in the UK. So yeah, that can obviously be super helpful, but that kind of, yeah, you can get in touch if that would be useful. And then the final thing is I've got a lot of different kind of links here, which again, I appreciate for now you can't access, but I will send these out so that you've got kind of the curriculum links I was talking about in terms of 11 plus, 13 plus, the kind of computerized practice links, written resources. We've also got reading, vocabulary links, interview guides, and all of that kind of stuff. So I'll make sure that all of that is sent out in the follow-up email so that you can access those as and when needed. And if you would like any of the tutoring support, you can just let your client manager at Keystone know, if that's kind of like Journal, Joyce or Charlie, and they'll be able to put some support in place over the summer if your child is taking these tests imminently. So that was kind of all that I had to share. Thank you all for listening and sticking with us. As I say, I'll follow up with all of this information and with the recording so that you can refer back to it if you would like. And please do not hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions at all.